All right. So the last section we're going to talk about in this whole course. So this whole class was about creating the foundations of white supremacy, particularly before the 1900s. And a major part of this foundation was the is our history of voter suppression. I mean, how we eventually how white supremacy eventually overthrew Reconstruction was directly linked to their ability to suppress the black vote. So we're going to kind of dive into the history of this and then see how this is affecting us even to this day. So I want to start off playing this Washington Post opinion piece about the history of voter intimidation and suppression.
Voter suppression never went away. It evolved.
They say to me, well, we thought we had done away with poll taxes. We thought we had done away with intimidation. We have all kind of obstacles been placed in our way. It's the same game with a different name.
To understand how we got here, historian Carol Anderson says we first need to understand white rage.
White rage is not how we often think about it. We often think of rage as being this kind of violent backlash or uproar. We know that there's something wrong with the violence that takes down a child. We know that something is wrong with the violence that 6 dogs on nonviolent protesters in Birmingham. We know something's wrong with that. But the kinds of quiet policies that led to that moment, it takes us a long time to recognize the policies themselves are predicated on white supremacy and exclusion.
Anderson says the trigger for white rage is black advancement. For each advancement blacks made for voting rights, there was an opposite reaction of white rage. That was the case in Mississippi after the passage of the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to freed black men.
Because Mississippi said, how do we write a law saying we don't want black people to vote without writing a law that says explicitly we don't want black people to vote? Because the 15th Amendment said you can't write a law that's that explicit. What Mississippi did was Mississippi said, we will take the societally imposed conditions on African Americans and use those conditions as the access to the ballot box.
Mississippi passed a new state constitution that required every citizen to pay a poll tax, pass a literacy test, and in some cases, meet a property requirement. At the time, black people were less than 30 years out of slavery when they earned no money and were blocked from reading. The Mississippi Plan of 1890 was applied equally to black and white voters, but white men could get around the barriers with so-called grandfather clauses. If they or a relative had voted before the Civil War ended, they could skip the poll tax or literacy test. A Mississippi governor later admitted the provisions had no other purpose than to eliminate blacks from politics. That's how a blueprint to circumvent the 15th Amendment was created, and other states followed Mississippi's lead. In the Jim Crow era, black voters were often met by violence. Civil rights workers who helped other African Americans to vote were shot, lynched, or violently harassed by vigilantes and police. And even though the 19th Amendment passed in 1920 to give women the right to vote, by 1940, only 3% of eligible African Americans in the South were registered to vote.
The civil rights movement is one of those moments in American history where the U.S. feels a depth of pride because it overcame something as villainous as Jim Crow. And it took a lot of bodies. It took this kind of moral power of the nonviolent movement. It took grassroots organization and mobilizing. It took Martin Luther King, this hard-earned legislative victory of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
The Voting Rights Act was hailed as a defining civil rights legislation of its time. It was especially important because it had an enforcement mechanism the 15th Amendment lacked. Under Sections 4 and 5 of the VRA, states with a history of discriminatory voting laws now needed federal approval or pre-clearance to change their election laws. This gave the Justice Department and federal courts in D.C. power to block discriminatory election laws. Its impact was profound. In Mississippi alone, voter turnout among blacks increased from 6% in 1964 to 59% in 1969. By then, President Lyndon B. Johnson had established anti-poverty programs to curb inequality. He created Medicare and Medicaid for the elderly and poor, and enacted education and housing reforms. By 1966, 85% of whites said the pace of civil rights progress was too fast, and by the 1968 presidential election, white resentment had coalesced into the Southern strategy.
Southern strategy, bringing Democrats and disaffected whites into the Republican Party.
The Southern strategy bolstered racist policies and practices without using racist language. Anderson says this applied to voter suppression as well.
Voter suppression is really based on the Mississippi Plan of 1890, where you can't say we don't want black people to vote. But that's the intent. That's been a key element in the policy of now the Republican Party. I would say another key element in policy was uttered by Paul Weyrich.
They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
To understand the language of voter fraud and voter suppression that's going on now, that's the framework. That our leverage, our power increases when the voting populace is constrained.
When President Ford signed the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 1975, the scope of the bill was expanded to protect Latino, Native American, and Asian voters by requiring bilingual elections. Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 1982, 1992, and 2006. The 2006 renewal included 15,000 pages of evidence of ongoing discrimination in voting. Congress said there was progress in eliminating first-generation barriers to voting, but that second-generation barriers had persisted.
Yes, we have made some progress. We have come a distance. We're no longer met with bullwhips, fire hoses, and violence when we attempt to register and vote. But the sad fact is, the sad truth is, discrimination still exists.
Second-generation barriers were laws that diluted the political power of minorities at the polls and included things like racial gerrymandering, poll closures, voter ID laws, and cutting down early voting and same-day voter registration. On a bipartisan basis, the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized for 25 years. 2 years later, in 2008, America elected its first Black president.
The election of Barack Obama is one in the latest string of the advancement of Black folk that leads to this incredible white rage.
In 2010, conservative Tea Party candidates swelled within the Republican Party. From 2011 to 2015, 395 new voting restrictions were introduced in 49 states, many of which were struck down by the Department of Justice. Anderson says the election and then re-election of America's first Black president was a factor behind the voting restrictions.
His advancement was the penultimate advancement, and therefore was the penultimate affront. I'm not surprised then that in his second term, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Shelby County v. Holder that the Voting Rights Act, particularly Section 4, which was what they called their pre-clearance provision, U.S. Supreme Court gutted that.
The Shelby ruling released 9 states and several counties from federal oversight and pre-clearance in changing their election laws. Southern states reacted swiftly.
2 hours after the Shelby County v. Holder decision, Texas implemented its racist voter ID law.
2 months later, North Carolina enacted HB 589, a bill that required strict photo ID requirements, eliminated same-day voter registration, and limited early voting. The U.S. Court of Appeals later struck down the law, saying that it targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. Since the Shelby ruling, at least 23 states have enacted newly restrictive statewide voter laws, such as voter roll purges, poll closures, and strict voter ID laws. This November, the Republican National Committee and Trump campaign are planning to flood polling locations with poll watchers, claiming to stop widespread voter fraud. A key Trump advisor is heard describing the multi-million-dollar plan in this leaked audio.
Right, traditionally, it's always been Republicans suppressing votes in places. Let's start protecting our voters. Right, we know where they are now. We know where they are. And they're all in one part of the state, and their voters are all in one part of the state. So let's start playing offense a little bit. And that's what you're going to see in 2020. That's markedly different. It's going to be a much bigger program, much more aggressive program, a much better funded program. And we're going to need all the help we can get.
Since the passing of Congressman John Lewis, the Senate has come under pressure to approve a bill to restore Voting Rights Act protections struck down by the Supreme Court. When the bill passed the House in 2019, 54 years after Lewis walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, he said this:
The vote is the most powerful, non-violent instrument or tool we have in a democratic society, and people should be able to use it.
We understand that the right to vote is foundational and bedrock in democracy. People are asking themselves, how did we get here?
Voter suppression never went away. It evolved. Left unchecked, it will continue to spread.
All right. So Carol Anderson, that's the one that she wrote the book White Rage, and it's an amazing book to read about basically the white lash that's happened over and over again every time there's an advancement in Black civil rights. So just talking about a little history of voter suppression, and kind of we need to start from the beginning and go back to, when the Constitution was written, there wasn't a whole lot defining, who could vote and who couldn't vote. That was kind of left to the states, and the states, had a variety of different, mainly it was just white property, male property owners, and a few states had, where women and Black people could very briefly, were part of it, but that that all ended with the Naturalization Act, which basically said only free whites were allowed to become naturalized citizens, and that essentially reserved the right to be citizens, and also the right to vote and serve on juries and all these things for white people, and then that was the case for the next century until the 15th Amendment during Reconstruction, where the radical Republicans, after the Civil War, passed, the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery, 14th Amendment, guaranteeing civil rights to Black people, and the 15th Amendment was the right to vote, because they knew that the only way that they were going to be safe and have power in this country after the Civil War was to be able to actually participate in our democracy. So that essentially banned it banned any kind of discriminatory practices that were used to suppress Black voters. But unfortunately, especially after, initially this happened with Black codes at first after the Civil War, but especially after Reconstruction ended in 1877, we saw states, even before the end of Reconstruction, immediately after 1870, you saw a lot of states starting to push a whole bunch of different discriminatory practices on around voting. And thanks to the Supreme Court, that kind of nullified a lot of the 15th Amendment for a while, saying that it was really up to the states. The federal government didn't have a capacity to enforce this. That opened up the window where all of a sudden we start seeing new forms of voter discrimination, like literacy tests. Like Carol Anderson, in the video talked about, they couldn't say we don't want Black people to vote, like they could before, but instead they could find different clever ways to, like having literacy tests, poll taxes, and violent intimidation, and then give grandfather clauses and stuff to white people so that they can avoid all that, because they knew Black people were among the most poor people and also the most illiterate, because slavery, banned. You couldn't teach enslaved people to actually read. So they, Black people, after they're freed, had very low literacy rates. They were poor. They just worked the last 400 years making white people, making wealth for white people. And now, there was not much, thanks to Jim Crow and black codes and everything, there wasn't much economic opportunity. So they found ways to exclude, exclude black people without actually saying they're excluding black people. And then they had openings for white people who may have been just as illiterate or just as poor, but they could be grandfather claused in. In addition, they had white-only primaries where only white people were allowed to participate in these primaries. And one of the biggest things they do, and we still have this today, is felony disfranchisement, which basically, this was started, right during this period of Reconstruction and Reconstruction ending, and it was specifically started in the South as a way to remove black people from voting, because you had all this, you had criminalized black lives, so black codes and vacancy laws. You're constantly pumping them through this like convict leasing system, so that, you're producing a lot of black felons. Black felons that had not really, most of them had never done anything wrong. But were just, part of the new white supremacy and the new slavery. So not only that, you see these southern states passing these laws saying, if you're a felon, you can't, vote either. And that, we still have many states still still has felon disenfranchisement. Millions of people, felons, but just disproportionately speaking, black people are not allowed to vote. There are many states that allow that to happen. There are different levels. Some states allow voters to actually vote in prison. Other ones that you have to complete your sentence and then you can have your rights restored. But there's still a bunch of states that you can never vote again if you're a felon, and that's specifically used to that's tactics specifically used to suppress the black vote. Some people say, oh, it's a deterrent, and it's about part of punishment, but there's no statistic alive, no study alive, anywhere that says that the felon disenfranchisement is actually has deterred anyone from committing crimes. This is specifically used to suppress black votes. And then in the 1890s, there was some, and then you see, like 1890s, there's some 100,000 American voters in Texas, and after a series of these literacy tests and poll taxes, we find it breaks down to like 5,000, and we see this across the board. By the end, by early 1900s, the South basically eliminated the black vote, and that's really important because not only was blacks were not allowed to participate in elections, but their bodies were still being counted as representation. So whites not only were able to dominate, but they were actually able to produce even more representation from the black people being suppressed. And this went on until the mid 1900s. That's why so many people celebrate the 19th Amendment. It gives a right for women to vote, but black people and mainly black indigenous people of color do not celebrate this in the 19th Amendment so much, because this was mainly white women got the right to vote. Native women were still still disenfranchised. It took them much longer. It took them another several more years, and really up until the 60s before they got rights. They got rights to vote, in different other states. And they had to wait till, the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act that basically, up until this act, Native Americans were denied the right to be citizens and denied the right to vote. But that act allowed Native Americans to be citizens, but it also kicked the right to vote to state by state, and Native Americans had to fight for the next 40 years before they were able to actually have the right to vote in every state. And then equally as tragic is like black women, there was many black women that were in the suffrage movement to get the 19th Amendment passed. Ida B. Wells was one of them. But when they got that movement, they got that passed. A lot of these black women that were suffragists, asked everyone else. I think Susan B. Anthony. I don't know if she was still alive, but many of the white suffragists, and they asked them, "Hey, can you come back down to the South now and help black women vote?" Because at the same time, white women gained the right to vote, and there was no barriers. But for black women, it was especially in the South. They still weren't able to vote till the mid '60s. to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the white suffragists basically refused to. They they ignored these pleas, and they did zero campaigning around the right for Black women's vote. So that's why the 19th Amendment, it's great, and it's also just a reminder of white supremacy, and a reminder that of like white feminism, as they call it, this idea of just supporting white women at the cost of all the other of non-white women. And then we saw in 1944 white only primaries was outlawed by the Supreme Court. All right, so that takes us to the 1950s, where we see the McCarran-Walter Act, which that starts, so that gives the rights of Asian Americans to start becoming citizens and having the right to vote. There were some already that were citizens, but for the most part, I mean, with the Chinese Exclusion Act in like the 1880s and a whole bunch of other anti-Asian bills and legislation that we'll talk about more in the Asian American history course class that we'll do later on. But there was a whole bunch of legislation that was not only banning immigration from Asian immigrants, but also denying them the ability to become citizens and right to vote. So that really, a lot of that was eliminated in the 1950s, particularly around the 1960s as well. And then then we have the big one, the 1965, the Voting Rights Act, which is essentially it's like the expansion. It's what the 15th Amendment was should have been if it wasn't dismantled by the Supreme Court. But the Voting Rights Act basically outlawed all of these previous voter suppression techniques, except for felon disenfranchisement, where they allowed that to continue to happen. And then even I've read statistics, even to this day, there are more proportionally per capita or whatever. There's more disenfranchisement today with a felon disenfranchisement than there was during Jim Crow, because that's been a major tool of disenfranchisement by the political right. But then we just see this explosion in the South of Black voter registration. And it started in 1964. You had Alabama that had these super low rates. Like Mississippi, 6% of Black people were registered to vote, and then within just 5 years, all of a sudden, they're in the majorities of Black people are voting, and that's huge. I mean, that gained millions of votes throughout the South and throughout the country, because that basically allowed everyone to gave everyone the right to vote, and outlawed a lot more obvious voter discrimination, such as poll taxes and things like that. But that also kicked off like a whole new during that period. We also saw the rise of the modern day Republican Party, which rose in the 50s and 60s around the Southern strategy, kicking off with like George Wallace and Barry Goldwater and Nixon, where they wanted to keep on pushing racist policies, but at the same time they wanted to sound very less racist. So they used a lot of dog whistles like law and order, or states' rights and all these things that seem that they're not racist, but the outcome is racism. And that's where we see this shift. It was a gradual shift, but and sometimes it took up to 1980s to really finish with a religious right. But we see this shift for where before it was a Democrat Party that opposed civil rights and anti and opposed desegregation, and we see a lot of that shift move to the Republican Party, particularly with Barry Goldwater, but really with Nixon really solidified that, where we saw a lot, from that point, we saw this massive shift of Democrats who opposed civil rights and opposed, desegregation, moved more towards the Republican Party. And a lot of the Dixiecrats like Strom Thurmond and Joseph McCarthy all, moved towards the Republican Party. And really over, big shifts was in the 50s and 60s around policies, but really the shift took up into the 80s when we saw that this complete reversal. And now at least policy-wise, people can argue about, whether this is true or not. But policy-wise, Democrats are more supportive of Black civil rights and desegregation, and Republicans are now more more supportive or more against, black civil rights and black, programs to help that, like reparations or affirmative action or things like that. They directly oppose. So we see this shift, between that, really occurred, the big parts of it, occurred, 50s and the 60s. And that it was about the same time that we start seeing the voters' rights. In fact, that really pushed this shift, particularly in the 1964 civil rights bill that outlawed Jim Crow, really pushed a lot of Democrats towards the Republican side to create this new party, this new like white man's party. And that, and they realized, they created strategies around these new, civil rights, laws. And, in 64, civil rights, banned Jim Crow. 65, Voting Rights Act. And 68 was Housing Act. So we start seeing, first of all, they needed a justification to continue different voting suppressions, so they came up with a lot of new ways to do voter suppression, but they created what we call the voter fraud myth. This is something they're still pushing today. It's this idea that we have massive amount of voter fraud. People trying to vote more than once, or people voting in the place of dead people, and identities and stuff. And that does happen, but it's very, very small. I'm going to show you some statistics. Like it's just like you're more likely to get hit by lightning and to have someone commit fraud. And most of the fraud is actually clerical issues or mistakes or things like that. So it's not a real issue. It's a made-up issue, but because they push this, and because so many people believe in this, they're able to push a lot of race-neutral, racist, voter laws. And that's when we start seeing like voter ID laws, because they know, there's many more barriers for Black, Indigenous people of color to get IDs than there are for white people. So they know this. So they know if they push voter ID laws, they know it'll be, the direct result is it will be less Black votes. And same with political gerrymandering, which both sides have definitely done their fair share as well. Felon disenfranchisement, they're the protectors of this law. Even as like like Florida in 2018, they just voted to get rid of that and to actually give back their voting rights, but their GOP government has found all kinds of clever ways to keep that from happening. And actually, they're going to keep any felons from voting in 2020. They've actually been successful with this. And it's also going to include eliminating early voting, same-day registration, all these different techniques. So all this stuff, they claim is being done to fight voter fraud, but in reality, this is being pushed to continue to suppress minority voting. And then we start seeing this title, because people that used to do this voter suppression used to be called segregationists, but that really had a bad name, especially when Martin Luther King started, organizing these rallies that were being taped and being portrayed, these beatings, they're basically taping, dogs, attacking Black children, and sending that, during civil rights movements and sending it all over the country. And so basically, there was this backlash. It was no longer socially acceptable to be a segregationist, to be a white supremacist, to be a racist, so that's, when segregationists realize this, and they start, trading, they start finding different ways to continue pushing segregation, but without less racist and less socially acceptable names. So a lot of people talk about that. This is when they traded segregationists for the new term conservative, which it's not new at that moment, but that was what the new modern Republican Party was kind of, centering around this kind of conservatism, when in reality they were still pushing the same policies as segregationists. And this is really what we're gonna have a whole class talking about the history of this, because it's really important history that no one really knows. Even though this party, controls the majority of our government, no one really knows how they became be, it was just scary. But all this happened, all these Voter Rights Act happened. It didn't happen. I mean, people just, our government just didn't give this to people. There was a massive amount of people fighting for their rights. And one big person that was involved in voter rights was Fannie Lou Hamer. And I just want to play this quick video about a little bit of history of her involvement.
Women have the vote, at least on paper. The amendment passes and is ratified. It doesn't mean that Black women, yay, we can vote. No, now you're under the same restrictions that Black men were under after the Reconstruction period.
It's an incomplete victory.
Native Americans have to wait 4 more years to even be considered citizens. Chinese immigrants won't achieve full rights until the 1940s.
People want to prohibit people from having free and uncovered access because that means that power and resources will then be redistributed. And then who will that favor? And so there's this fear that's behind all of this.
In the segregated South, an organized effort keeps Black citizens from the ballot box.
Residency requirements, poll taxes, literacy requirements.
Very real threat of violence, of lynching, were visited upon communities who did try to exercise the right to vote, which was why there are vast communities where people didn't even attempt to try to vote.
One woman brings the struggle to the national stage. Fannie Lou Hamer was born the last of 20 children to a family of Mississippi sharecroppers.
Growing up in the Mississippi Delta, she thinks, well, voting could help change my economic circumstances, and so I am going to try and go and register to vote.
She isn't allowed to register. Just for attempting it, she is fired from her job of 18 years and put out of her home. But she persists, becoming a voter and an activist.
The bus that she's in gets stopped, and all of the people who are with her who are trying to register to vote, they are removed from the bus.
Once again, women asking for their democratic rights are thrown in jail.
3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was State Highway Patrol. He said, "We're going to make you wish you was dead."
She is physically assaulted to the point that that assault has lifelong effects on her.
This time, there is no public outcry. President Johnson pays no attention. But Hamer does not back down. Instead, she launches a campaign for the U.S. Senate. Though the longest of long shots in a district where only 5% of African Americans are registered to vote, she uses the platform to raise her voice.
We are sick and tired of being sick and tired.
In 1964, Hamer speaks at the National Democratic Party convention in Atlantic City.
We want to register to become first-class citizens. And if the freedom...
She told the story of what was happening to Black people in their quest for their natural born right to vote.
It's this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America.
She used her platform to tell a story that I don't think many people in the nation knew.
She recognized that if the South was going to change, it was going to change at the hands of people like her.
1 year later, Congress passes a law to enforce the 19th and 15th Amendments, the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
As much as we want the story of voting rights, not just for women, but for everyone in the United States, to be a forward trajectory, there are always new barriers that people find ways to put up.
Amazing woman. Doesn't get as much credit as she should. So speaking of new barriers, so after the 1965 Voter Rights Act, there was all these new, voter ID laws and stuff. But a big part that was kind of holding these back was the Section 5, Section 4 and 5 from the Voting Rights Act, or the VRA is what they call it now. And that basically said that if you're in a state with a long history of voter suppression, which is like all of the South, and then if you're going to make any kind of changes to your voting rights, for voting laws, you had to get it approved by the Department of Justice at the federal level. And this, I mean, it didn't stop all new voting, all new, voting discrimination, but it stopped a lot of them. And it was really one of the most powerful parts of this 1965 Voting Rights Act law. But then in 2010, especially after the election of Barack Obama, you really saw this resurgence in the Republican Party to find new ways to suppress the vote, because he was so successful at bringing so many, particularly Black people, out to vote. That really scared a lot of people on the right. So they came up with all these new, voter, ID laws and stuff, statewide, several different states, including Alabama, which was, the DOJ, struck down most of them, but the Alabama actually used, that to actually, challenge that in court, saying that, the Voters' Rights Law Act is no longer necessary. Discrimination is a thing of the past and all this stuff. So, and then went to the Supreme Court, and again, an example of just how messed up our Supreme Court is despite the fact that, like there was a mountain of evidence that this discrimination is still a major factor in voting and throughout this country. They ignored all that, and Chief Justice Roberts, actually said, this is what he says in the dissent. He says, "Our country has changed, and advanced clearance of voting rule changes is no longer needed." He basically gets it in his whole, whatever you call that, not the dissent, but the approval side. He writes this whole, he writes about just how, we're just a better society now. This stuff doesn't happen. It was a thing of the past. Racism is dead, basically, and which is just insane for a Supreme Court justice to say, especially the amount of evidence they have. But anyways, our Supreme Court is not neutral. Is oftentimes a tool of white supremacy. So they basically gut this. They say, this is no longer needed. The South has learned their lessons, and there's no racism and discrimination anymore. So they basically removed the Section 5 of the Voters' Rights Act. And immediately, that first video talks about within like 2 hours, we start seeing Texas passes, these new voter ID law. That's specifically that they pass it specifically to start oppressing Black voters, and then we saw this waterfall of just like of all from Republican states passing these new new forms of voter suppression laws, and they were all they're all these cookie cutter laws. They were all had the same language, which is we later found out this was because, again, we talked about ALEC, American Legislation Exchange Council, the organization that opened up, for-profit prisons again and brought back convict leasing, and did a whole bunch of other things, and essentially, helped orchestrate the rise of mass, incarceration with all these, getting tons of states passing, 3-strike laws and all these, horrific, criminal justice laws. Is a wonderful organization is back again, we saw in that first video, Paul Warwick, he's the founder of this organization. He gives that speech in that Washington Post video. It's this famous, or infamous, whatever, speech in 1980 where he says, I don't want everyone to vote. Republican Party, does well when we suppress votes. He basically meant that his main, strategy is to suppress votes. And then he's very successful at that. His organization, ALEC, basically, crafts all these voter ID laws and all these, eliminations of same-day voting and, closing down polling stations and voting purges and stuff, all these, new modern, voting suppression tactics. They create all these laws, and they work with 34, states, mainly Republican states to pass all this stuff with, literally months after, after John Roberts says that this isn't a problem anymore. And that's how quickly, it's just like, as soon as he said that, it's just all the problems, it just returned. And some of them were dismantled, some of them were blocked but most of them passed. These are within 20 states. 20 states have new voter ID laws and make it harder to register. They cut back voting days and hours, made it harder to restore voting rights for people, felons. So we just saw this tidal wave of just voter suppression that occurred immediately after the gutting of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So I'm going to read this from Carol Anderson, White Rage. She said, once it became clear that the voter turnout rate of blacks had nearly equaled that of whites, as Penda Hare of the Progressive Advancement Project has noted, conservatives were looking at it and saying, we've got to clamp things down. They've always tried to suppress the black vote, but it was then that they came up with a new scheme. Those efforts hid the anger and determination behind a legitimate sounding, noteworthy concern, protecting the integrity of the ballot box for voter fraud. Still, Paul Weyrich, a conservative activist and the founder of the American Legislation Exchange Council, ALEC, was explicit early on. I don't want everyone to vote, he said, noting that the GOP's leverage in the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down. But with 15 million new voters already, and with African Americans exercising their citizens' rights at rates virtually equal to whites, something had to be done. That is when Alex stepped up and to draft voter ID legislation that popped up in very similar forms in states like Pennsylvania, Texas, Wisconsin. These laws required, among other things, particular types of identification that properly and immersively applied make it difficult for African Americans and others to vote. The Nation magazine writer John Nichols is a quick little interview where he talks a little bit about how Paul Reich and on all them, how the ALEC was so successful in doing, passing so many voter, suppression laws.
ALEC was founded in 1973 by the losers of the great political battles of the 1960s and early 1970s, people who had nominated Barry Goldwater for president only to see that campaign crash and burn, people who tried to nominate Ronald Reagan for president in 1968 only to fail, and people who had finally put their chips on Richard Nixon only to see that endeavor crash and burn in the Watergate scandal. Realizing that their goals could not be achieved in an honest political fight, they decided to create a secretive organization that would link state legislators to corporations with money, obviously, and then implement an agenda at the state level, usually in moments when a lot of people weren't looking. They knew they'd be covered at the federal level. They figured out that they could actually change tremendous amounts of policy at the states. So that's where they focused their energy. And they have never forgotten that they were founded by people who couldn't win elections. And so they put a lot of their energy on gaming the electoral process. They have three key areas where they work. Number one, in suppressing the vote. They push model voter ID legislation that would make it harder for millions, in fact, tens of millions of Americans to cast ballots. Two, in erecting barriers to direct democracy. They are very critical of initiatives and referendums, particularly those passed by citizens to, say, raise the minimum wage, create a living wage, or to add benefits. Anything that affects corporations, they talk about how that you might erect greater barriers to putting such legislation on the ballot and to passing it, perhaps by requiring supermajorities. Finally, and this is perhaps their key area of work in recent years, they are the most aggressive promoters in the country of clearing away barriers for corporations and wealthy people to spend whatever they want to win elections. And so they're huge backers of the Citizens United decision, which allows corporations to spend freely on campaigns, but also a host of other measures designed to clear away any barriers to corporate spending. So effectively what you understand is ALEC is about tipping the playing field, about gaming the system so that at the end of the day, the people who couldn't win elections in the 1960s and 1970s, and frankly couldn't today, can prevail in an electoral landscape that they have designed.
All right. So another big strategy that that the political right has pushed is poll watching. So they've done this for since for a long time. You really it started with segregationists in the South, that they did poll watchings where they basically just prevented, Black people from actually voting, and with intimidation and violence. And then even up in the 60s, they did that, especially as, the modern Republican parties, forming, Republicans started adapting this method. But eventually by the 80s, they go too far, and they get banned for a while. But they get banned for, by a court case where they're not allowed to poll watch anymore, because it is basically just used it to intimidate voters. But that ban actually just went away in 2018, so that they're actually starting a massive poll watching campaign again for 2020. Let me read this from Mariah Blank, writes in the Ballot Cops. Conservative anti-voting fraud fervor first arose around the same time as two turning points in American politics. The first was John F. Kennedy's narrow presidential win in 1960, which many Republicans attributed to voter fraud in Illinois and Texas. The second was the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which, by banning discriminatory voting practices, stoked fear in some quarters around the rising power of Black voters. During the run-up of the 1964 presidential election, the Republican National Committee launched Operation Eagle Eye, the nation's first large-scale anti-voter fraud campaign. As part of the program, the RNC recruited tens of thousands of volunteers to show up at polling stations, mostly in inner cities, and challenge voters' eligibility using a host of tools and tactics, including cameras, two-way radios, and calls to Republican-friendly sheriffs. So this is, the idea, so this is really, the thing that pushes this is this idea of this false idea of voter fraud. So they make up this idea of voter fraud. They sell it really well to a lot of people, like particularly after the Republican Party got banned from doing this. They found a lot of other groups, that, because we're still allowed to, as long as they weren't part of the Republican Party, like the Tea Party. And so the Tea Party was this, we'll talk more about this in the political right class, was basically an astroturf, which was this false movement. I mean, a lot of people in it, thought it was a real movement, but it was really funded by the Koch brothers and Fox News, and coordinated. They had, very specific, well thought out, intentional talking points that they pushed onto the Tea Partiers, and then just let them, the Tea Partiers run with it. And the big one was voter fraud. They kept on implying that, Black people were stealing elections by committing voter fraud, which, galvanized, the Tea Party folks, who started organizing, poll watchers, organizations. And so they essentially, they would go in, some of these organizations, like one of the most popular one or biggest one was True the Vote, which I believe started in, I want to say started maybe in Texas, or Tampa, but eventually went, there's organizations all over the country now. There's like 30 or 40 of them now. And they would, before the election, they would go to, they would get voters registrations, and then they would comb through all, the state, the local, registration lists, and find any discrepancy, they can find, like, like a misspelled name or like a capitalization that was wrong or something, anything that they can, and then they would, submit saying that, these people are frauds, and even, they'll do this like right at the last second, and oftentimes this will, raise red flags, and their voter statuses would be suspended. Or it would require additional proof, like additional forms of ID or additional forms of proof of residency, which, a lot of times people weren't prepared for, and they were able to successfully, kind of remove a lot of votes that way. And their second tactic is they go in person to these stations, and they basically just harass, they go into like Black communities and harass voters. They make it so awful for the voters, and especially in these places that are already having the polling stations closed, and where there's like 6-hour long, 10-hour long lines, and then they go to these lines and just harass people, and then they try to claim people are voting wrong, and then it's just making this terrible experience where a lot of people will just leave, or if they're worried about or they'll call Republican friendly sheriffs and bring in law enforcement and stuff. And it's just, it's a form of intimidation and harassment that's been, especially in swing states where states like Wisconsin, where like it's just a couple, like I think it's like 40,000, Trump won by 40,000. These kind of tactics can actually, win over swing states. I'll read in the New York Times, an editorial on voter harassment, particularly around True the Vote. So the Tea Party group True the Vote depends on largely minority precinct and combs the registration records for the slightest misspelling or address error. It uses this information to challenge voters at the polls, and though almost every challenge is baseless, the arguments and delays frustrate those in line and reduce turnout. The thing that's different from the days of overt discrimination is the phony pretext of combating voter fraud. Voter identity fraud is all but non-existent, but the assertion that it might exist is used as an excuse to reduce the political rights of minorities, the poor, students, older Americans, and the other groups that tend to vote. And then, as I said, in 2008, 18, a federal judge, so it was like in the 80s, the Republican Party got so bad with poll watching, and they were harassing people so much that the Democrats actually brought lawsuits against them, and they were actually banned from doing this. But that ban, expired in 2018, and it wasn't renewed. So now the GOP is pumping in millions and millions of dollars to pump this massive poll watching, which is just going to be in every swing state and in every community of color. There's just going to be an enormous amount of harassment in 2020 from this. So it's really it's a really big deal. And then I'm gonna play. I don't know if you saw The Newsroom. It's a fictional story, but but it's based on a lot of facts. A lot of the times that they're reporting, it's this fictional character, a news reporter, but it's around the time the rise of the Tea Party, but he does a. I want to play this quick segment, even though it is fictional. Everything he talks about is actually real and it's facts, and he does a really good job talking about just like the purpose of all these new voter ID laws.
Tonight's top story is a woman named Dorothy Cooper. Dorothy Cooper is a 96-year-old resident of Chattanooga, Tennessee, and has been voting for the last 75 years. This year, she's been told she can't. A new law in Tennessee requires residents to show a government-issued photo ID in order to vote. Dorothy Cooper doesn't have a driver's license because Dorothy Cooper doesn't have a car. Dorothy Cooper doesn't have a passport. A vacation abroad was never in her future. Tennessee isn't alone. At this moment, 33 states have proposed or already adopted the same voter ID laws that have disqualified Dorothy Cooper from the one fundamental thing that we all do as Americans. It's estimated that 11%, or roughly 20 million people, don't have government-issued voter IDs and will be disenfranchised this November. Why? To crack down on the terrible problem of voter fraud. Governor Rick Perry of Texas, who is about to enter the presidential primary race, is serious about cracking down on the problem.
Making sure that there's not fraud, making sure that someone's not manipulating that process makes all the sense in the world to me.
To me too, because voter fraud is such a huge problem that during a 5-year period under the Bush administration, when 196 million votes were cast, the number of cases of voter fraud reached 86. Not 86,000, 86. Here's what that number looks like as a percentage of votes cast. 4/100,000ths of a percent. This would be called a solution without a problem, but it's not. It's just a solution to a different problem. Republicans have a hard time getting certain people to vote for them, so life would be a lot easier if certain people just weren't allowed to vote at all. I'm ashamed to say that 32 of the 33 voter ID laws were proposed by Republican legislators and passed by Republican-controlled state houses and signed into law by Republican governors.
All right. So I think that that was just like I said, that's a fictional show, but Dorothy Roberts and what he's talking about, these are all real things that happened. So this gets into like a list of like, I want to talk about how we modern day voter suppression happens, and it's specific strategies that's being used right now. The biggest one, what justifies everything, is this voter fraud myth. Is narrative that there's an enormous problem with voter fraud, with people trying, trying to vote twice or to commit fraud while voting, and the reality is, this is not a problem at all. the report, there was this report, similar report in the Brennan Center who did the Truth About Voter Fraud that found in review of the 2016 election, 130 million voted, only 4 cases of voter fraud was found. I mean, it's like next thing you know, it's 0.00013%. And even with, there are some voter fraud, there are some cases, but like 90% of those cases are just clerical errors or just bad data. It's just a lot of times it's just accidents, or like people that didn't realize they weren't registered, tried to vote anyways, and no one stopped them. Or like sometimes, like if some people, there's cases of felons who didn't realize that their rights were actually taken away, tried to vote, and no one stopped them, and then that's considered voter fraud. But it's insane. I mean, it's not a problem at all. You're more likely to be struck by lightning than to be able to actually impersonate another voter at the polls. But this is, again, this is just that myth, like black criminality, that white supremacy has used to justify basically being really awful towards black people. So that's and exploiting and maintaining white supremacy through messed up means like in voter suppression and violence. So again, this myth serves a purpose. It justifies all the other forms of voter suppression that I'm going to talk about. And the biggest one is voter ID laws. So these are ideas that if you want to register to vote, or if you want to show up to vote, you need to have government issue IDs. 34 states require this, and a lot of people make the case is like, well, everyone has to do it. It's not that big of a deal, and it seems like that. If you don't really read about it and explore about it, it seems like it's not that big of a deal. I think most people that are okay with this don't really think about it, or they're like, they already have IDs, so it's not a big deal. But there's actually legitimately a lot of barriers for a lot of people for getting government-backed IDs, and those barriers, most people experience barriers are primarily Black, Indigenous people of color who mainly vote Democrat. So that's why we see so many of these voter ID laws, because a lot of times, poor people living in poverty, they don't have transportation, they're working like 3 jobs, are dealing with all kinds of issues. If you're, it can be a lot of barriers. Like Native Americans, like the North Dakota in 2018, the GOP, legislation passed this law saying not only did everyone have to have voter ID laws, or IDs, but they couldn't use PO boxes. They had to have actual addresses on their IDs. And most people living on reservations, Native reservations, they don't have addresses. They just, that's why they have PO boxes. So that, so that was that was passed mainly to disenfranchise, Native Americans who were going to vote primarily for Democrats. So that's what this is all about. And like they wouldn't do it if it hasn't been proven. This has been a proven tactic to reduce non-white, voters and Democratic voters. So like I said, more than 10% of U.S. citizens lack such identification. 18% of young voters lack it, and 25% African Americans. So when we know that 10% of the population doesn't have an ID, that's an enormous amount of people that don't have it, and maybe like and they're having difficulties getting it. So it's just ridiculous. This law. And then Wisconsin, like the Wisconsin ID restrictions, 300,000 people in 2016 didn't have an ID, mostly Democrat voters, and they couldn't vote, during that 2016 election because of the Wisconsin ID restrictions. And Trump won that state by 22,000 votes. And then, we have, audio of like, actual GOP people saying that, like they passed this, that's the thing. They admit a lot of times Republicans will admit that they're passing this to restrict minority votes, and a lot of this is based on to reduce the gains that they'll talk about how we need to reduce the gains that Obama created for Black voters. So it's definitely there's no neutrality to this, even though like it may seem like it, but this is definitely a ploy to stop Democrats from gaining votes. Another big one are aggressive voter purges and what we call voter caging. So in 1993, they passed the National Voter Registration Act that allows voters to be purged, only if they ask to be, or if they move, or they're convicted of felonies, or die, or things like that. So it's, I mean, it makes sense honestly to like every once in a while kind of clean out your voter rolls, so you're not like sending registration cards to people that passed away a long time ago. So there is some sense to this, but a lot of Republican governments have kind of ran with this, and they've used this as a way to remove a lot of people's registration. A lot of times when people don't know that they've been removed and don't find out until they show up to the poll to vote, and then at the same time these states also don't have same day registration. So this is huge on winning like states like Ohio. Ohio went red in 2000 for both times for Bush when it should have gone blue, but it was because they denied enough Democrat voters from voting, and like tens of thousands of Democrat voters were denied, and they didn't realize it until they went to the polls, because how voter caging works is they'll mail like the Republican Party will mail addresses, or not Republican, the government will mail voter registration cards to everyone saying you need to re-register, you need to sign something and mail it back. And if they don't mail it back, they'll go ahead and assume, well, those people must have moved on, so let's just purge them from the voter rolls. When in reality, like how many times, how much junk mail do you miss every day? Like, I mean, it's just like so many people never even received these cards and never even saw these cards, or it's just gotten lost in the mail, or they forgot to mail it back, and then they didn't realize that, and then they showed up to the polls and they were and they were denied. They said they were purged from their registration, and there's no same day registration. So so many people lose their right to vote this way. And yes, they can still register afterwards, but they don't find out until the day of that they've been purged. Like Ohio purges voters after missing one election and not responding to the mail notice. So if you don't vote in an election in Ohio and then you miss one mail notice, you're purged from the registration. So then maybe you'll show up the next election and you can't vote, and you have to, so over the past 5 years, Ohio has purged 2 million voters from the voting rolls, and Trump won Ohio by literally like a little less than 500,000. So this is huge, and these purges, these crazy purges, are being done mainly by Republican parties because they know, it's like Paul Weyrich said, if you just, it's not, you don't need to specifically target, necessarily black people. If you just, target the voting population as a whole, white people are more likely to be able to overcome a lot of these barriers. So you ultimately are disenfranchising disproportionately more white people or more black people. And then even though, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of conservatives that have been purged as well. So this isn't just, yeah, but I mean, definitely, people of color or black indigenous people of color are some of the main, victims of these voter purges. And then in 2018, the Brennan Center for Justice report, they report on purges, and they found that 9 southern states, all listed under the Section 5, which were all states that used to, that have a long history of voter discrimination and used to have to get permission from the DOJ until, the Supreme Court decided that it wasn't the case anymore. They found that all of them were purging voters more aggressively than any other state. So all these states that have a long history of voter discrimination are all of a sudden also, purging voters, in crazy numbers right now. And then we see, and there was even more. Chris Kobach, he was the head of Trump's, voter fraud commission that was supposed to, expose all this voter fraud, and actually disbanded because they couldn't find any voter fraud. But the Kansas secretary, when he was the Kansas Secretary of State, he launched this program called the Interstate Cross Checks. And they basically, it's a database that aggregated voter registration records from multiple states. If they found, that you were registered in more than one state, they just went ahead and purged you, your vote without even trying to figure it out. And it's just so many people's, registration got purged. And they didn't find out until they were trying to vote, the day of the election. So, and that's crazy to me. Like, I think about how simple that is. Like, I've moved to multiple states before. Like, I live in DC, but I used to live in North Carolina, and I tried to end my North Carolina registration, but for some reason it didn't work. And I mean, I'm so called all the time. North Carolina calls me, or sends mail, wants me to show up for jury duty, and I have to explain to them I don't live in North Carolina anymore. But I'm still registered in North Carolina, even though I would never vote in 2 states. I vote in DC, but that doesn't matter, like because of clerical errors, they can't seem to remove it from their database. And to think, I mean, if Chris Kobach, if his like program found that out, my voter registration would have been purged in DC, and I wouldn't have found out until I tried to vote. But luckily in DC you have same day registration, so it doesn't matter, which is insane that everyone doesn't have that same day registration. Just because it's that would completely eliminate any problems of voter purges and voter caging, but that's not the case in most states, or at least most Republican states. So that moves us to the next, section: eliminating same-day registration, reducing early voting, closing poll stations. And we saw, we see this, since the Supreme Court struck down Section 5 in the VRA, southern states from Arizona and North Carolina have closed down at least 868 polling places, and most of these polling places are in, Black communities and in Democratic areas. Many states like North Carolina, Ohio eliminated same-day registration. So, like, Ohio definitely stole the election for Bush in both 2000 and 2004. If you study that, it's just insane how many voters they purged and then didn't tell anyone, and there was just like tens of thousands of people sitting at polls being like, why, like being told they can't vote. If there was same day registration, that would none of that would have happened, and it's more likely Bush would never have been our president, and but that's why Republican parties don't want same day registration, which is crazy. It's just so crazy to me. And then all these changes, disenfranchise, poor minority voters, especially ones that have, transportation barriers, maybe language barriers, maybe financial barriers, maybe if they live on reservations, or if they live in areas that, I mean, like, you see this nowadays. When watch 2020, there's going to be all the places that are going to have 10 out, 5, 6, 10, 8-hour, whatever lines are all going to be in Black communities, and this happens every election. And like, who can spend 8 hours? And that's one of the reasons why the Democrats tried to pass a bill recently to make the election day a holiday, a federal paid holiday, so people can take off and they can wait in these long lines. And Mitch McConnell called it a power grab, because he knew that if people can if everyone had, could equally cast their votes, that they would lose. So yeah, Senate is never going to pass that. So it's crazy. And you look at, this is going to happen like in the primaries in 2020 in Kentucky. You look at, so a lot of this, I'll preface this that, like a lot, Kentucky lost a lot of funding due to COVID. They lost their capacity to actually have a normal election. So they knew that they were going to close down thousands of polling stations. So that's statewide. So they knew this, but so that's not the problem. I mean, that was COVID. It was out of their hands. They had to rush to do, mail-in stuff. I mean, it was a mess. And they did the best they could, with a lot of this. But their decision on what polling stations is what is really astounding. Is they looked at, the biggest, Black communities, and they removed all but one polling stations in most of those communities. Like, there's, half of Black Kentuckians live in Jefferson County, 600,000 registered voters, and they only left one polling station. And I have a lot of white friends in Kentucky who live in white majority white communities, like 90%, 5% white. And they all reported in the primary that they just walked in and walked out. It was like, no way. And they talked about on Facebook, oh, I don't know what people are talking about. This was such a, Kentucky did such a great job. But you go to these Black communities, and it's just completely the opposite. And that's the reality behind closing poll stations. If there's not, even if you have to close poll stations, it's majority of poll stations are closed in Black communities. And then, again, we talk about, felon disenfranchisement. So this is a big, 6 million Americans are unable to vote because of past criminal records. And this came about, directly, and during the overthrow Reconstruction era, where, these southern states were looking for new ways to disenfranchise people. And they knew, since they created a racist criminal justice system, that convict leasing and Black codes and all that stuff, they knew, already they could just, just add the fact that if you get arrested, you lose your right to vote, and that's been a tool specifically. They claim that it's to deter, it's part of the punishment to deter future crime, but no one's not going to commit crime, because they're worried about losing their right to vote. And then oftentimes, a lot of these black people didn't commit crimes, or were forced to, live in, such horrific poverty that was their only options. So it's not right to, take away people's votes just because they're criminals, or because they have a criminal past. So if you look at statistics, 1 in every 13 voting age Black Americans have lost their right to vote through this. This is 4 times the rate of all other Americans. So Republicans that know, that push this stuff, they know what they're doing. They know that this is mainly disenfranchising Black Americans. It's also disenfranchising white as well, but it's mainly, they come out on top with the felon disenfranchisement laws. And then there's a lot of states that have gotten rid of this, like Maine, Vermont, California. Felons can actually, they never lose their right to vote. They can actually vote from prisons. And then there's a lot of states that have restored, where people, once people leave the prison and do their time, they get their right to vote back. But then there's a lot of states like Florida, Iowa, and Virginia where felons and ex-felons permanently lose their right to vote. And there's been a big push, especially since 2018, to kind of overturn that, particularly in Florida. So Florida, roughly 1.5 million Floridan residents, 2.5% of the state's population are disenfranchised. And in 2016, 1 in 4 Black residents could not cast a ballot. That's 25% of the Black population in Florida were denied the right to cast a vote. And Clinton only lost by 120,000 votes. So it's very possible that Clinton would have won Florida if they didn't have that. And then so in 2018 they actually passed. The voters overwhelmingly passed a referendum to restore, just to eliminate this whole, to give felons, who served their time and they're not convicted of, I think, murder and rape, those people would get their voting rights back. But then the GOP governor who in the House, who many of them are only there because of a voter, felon disenfranchisement. They already passed a bunch of laws. They passed one particularly that said that in order to get that right to vote back, they had to pay all fees and retributions and everything to cover their imprisonment. And they don't even have a system in place to calculate that. It's estimated it would take 6 years to figure out how much a lot of these felons actually owe and back pay. And then if you we're going to have a class where we're going to talk about returning citizens, people that leave, how just impossible it is to make a living and make any money. You're like denied so many benefits and you're denied so many economic opportunities. It's horrific, to try to make, so just to expect these people to all of a sudden cough up, I don't know, thousands of dollars, if not more, to get the right to vote. It's insane. And that was actually challenged on court, and it was overturned on local courts, and then went to the appeal court, which was basically like 90% Trump appointees. And they were all like, yeah, we're going to support, our political party. So they overruled that appeal, but then went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically sided with Florida. So even despite the fact in 2018, voters, overwhelmingly, like something like 75% of voters, voted to reinstate voting rights for felons. None of these voters are going to be able to vote in 2020. There's actually like 85,000 felons actually registered to vote and were planning on voting. And Florida was basically like, if any of you do this, we're going to actually prosecute you and throw you back in jail. So it's a pretty messed up situation. And then, misinformation and tactics. This is a big one that the political right does, where they, Democrats, especially in 2018, like, Nevada had robocalls, telling people, to vote on the day after the election, or sending out false information about registration or voting. This is a big, thing that happens a lot across the country. And then intimidation, we talked about this as well, but the RNC sponsored a group called the National Ballot Security Task Force for pulling, like poll watchers, and they basically go to these Black communities and just harass people that are trying to vote, and they end up intimidating a lot of people from voting as well. And then we saw in 2018, we saw a massive amount of voter suppression, particularly in Georgia was a big one where Stacey Abrams was running for mayor. And it, I mean, who knows? You can't know for sure, but it was close enough to make the case that there wasn't a voter for it wasn't voter fraud that Stacey Abrams would have won. But either way, I mean, we shouldn't have to make that assumption. We should just, people should be able to vote. This is insane. And so they did all the things that we talked about that happened in, 4.5-hour lines in black communities. White lines, white communities, they just walk right in. Students, like all kinds of absentee ballot, problems, broken voting machines, and Brian Kemp, the governor who won, like, was also the person overseeing the election integrity, and it was a really, there was so much voter suppression in 2018. And then a big part, and in this, I'll give to the Republicans. This is something that's done on both sides of the aisle. I mean, you can make the case that Republicans probably done this more, but the fact that Democrats still do this as well is, this should be a nonpartisan issue. But gerrymandering. So the idea behind gerrymandering is every 10 years. There's a census, and we kind of have, we update, the demographics, and, people move around and stuff and move to different voting districts, and we want to have equal districts of equal numbers of people, so we have like fair representation. So oftentimes we'll have to redraw the boundaries of districts to ensure that there's the same amount of people in every district. It's supposed to be done, it's called redistricting, and it's supposed to be done, as a nonpartisan, issue, but it's very partisan. Basically, whoever owns has power of the state government gets to draw their lines however they want. And the Supreme Court has ruled that you can't draw them around race. You can't racially gerrymander, but you can partisan gerrymandering. But if all the black voters are voting Democrat, you could just say, oh, I was just gerrymandering around partisans around a Democratic Party, when in reality, like it's definitely racial gerrymandering. They're just able to avoid it really well. That's when, so it is, it's messed up. But there's a lot of, there's a lot of states that are actually getting around this. There's states that have, form independent commissions for redistricting. It's Alaska, Arizona, California, Idaho, Montana, Washington, where, when it's time to redraw lines, they actually let nonpartisan groups, independent commissions, draw these lines with lots of oversight and lots of transparency. That's there's 7 states have and then there's a bunch of states that only have one congressional district because they don't have much population, so they don't even need this to ever do this. But for the most part, most states are open to gerrymandering. So there has been a lot of pushes to kind of to go to these independent commissions. So how gerrymandering works is you can have let's say you have a state like Ohio is a great example. There's a majority of voters in Ohio are Democrat, but it goes Republican every year because of gerrymandering. And that's basically, you have, if it was just a normal fair representation, 60% blue, 40% red, then you would have majority of blue of Democrat reps. But instead, in 2010, the Republicans controlled Ohio, so they redistricted it to the point where they were able to, create these crazy boundaries that essentially, shove, all the Democrats into a handful of places, and then left Republican majorities in these crazy drawn, boundaries. And the ultimate result is Ohio has more Republican state reps, even though there's more Democrat blue, voters, which it's pretty messed up. And we see, so 2010 was a bad year for gerrymandering. So the GOP won, in almost all these states. At the same time, the GOP was freaking out about, Obama winning so much, and bringing so many black voters out to the polls that they just went crazy on, especially with Alex's help, and it went crazy on trying to, gerrymandering in as many states as possible. And we can see, like this is, the results of this, so this is a, these are House seats from the 2012, election. This is after, the Republican Party gerrymandering, all these states, and you can see, like so the top bar is the popular vote. and then the bottom bar is how much representation they actually got. So in Florida, a popular vote, there was just a little bit more probably than people who supported Republicans and Democrats, but yet, they got, a huge, they got a bunch more representation. And same with Wisconsin. Wisconsin, there was probably more Democrat voters, barely, but Republicans won the majority. And same with Pennsylvania. Ohio was, it's about even. It goes back and forth. I think ultimately nowadays Ohio is a blue state voter-wise, popular-wise, but it's definitely a red state, because of gerrymandering. And same, with Virginia. So you just see the same thing. In Michigan, there's way more, Democrat voters, but because of gerrymandering, they Republicans won the most. And we see this happening all over. I mean, again, there is some states that Democrats do as well, like Arizona, Maryland, they do it too. So it's not just a Republican thing. But overall, overall, I'll just leave it at that. So, and I think, and not only is this bad because it gives more representation than deserved, but it also makes more extreme politics, happen as well. Because what happens, instead of like having districts that are heavily competitive against, you have these districts that are heavily Republican and heavily Democrat, so they don't have to worry about representing the other side. So that's why you see this polarization as well, and you see, some crazy guys. That's how a lot of really crazy governments or crazy politicians are elected at this point, because they don't have to worry about competition, because they're gerrymandered into a district where they don't have to be competitive anymore. So in 2018, there was a lot of anti-gerrymandering initiatives. So this is also an important Supreme Court case, Easley versus Promatari, I think. This is where we tried to, the Supreme Court was supposed to look at gerrymandering and see, and the hope was is that the Supreme Court was someday going to outlaw this. And they oppose, they say it's unconstitutional to do racial gerrymandering. So if you draw the boundaries by race, that's unconstitutional. But if you draw the boundaries by by party, that's okay. But the problem is all the non-white people mainly vote Democrat. So if you could draw the lines around parties and say it's all about party, you're just being partisan, which is unconstitutional. But in reality, you're actually being racially gerrymandering. So it's such a gray area, and it's ridiculous that SCOTUS they approved this. They said it was okay to continue partisan gerrymandering, just don't racially gerrymandering. Even though that's the end result of partisan gerrymandering. So it's just another point of just like this race neutral racism that's happening the Supreme Court loves to support. And then that's been challenged many times from North Carolina, Wisconsin, and a lot of these states had to redraw maps, and we're overturning some of these, gerrymandering districts from 2010, but the Supreme Court refuses to just outlaw it in general. But we did have a bunch of states have approved in 2018 election. They approved independent commissions. Michigan, Missouri, Utah, Colorado, even Ohio. So hopefully, as we go on, more and more states will outlaw, gerrymandering. But because the Supreme Court definitely is not going to anytime soon. So if you want to learn about your district and want to learn about if your district's been gerrymandering and the history around that, check the district.aclu, and you can get all kinds of information about that. And I wanted to put this slide, I didn't know exactly where to put it. I actually made a couple slides of just these long lists of things, because oftentimes most voter suppression is done by the political right. And I think it's important to recognize that and to state that, a lot of people want to be, both sides thing. And like, I understand with gerrymandering, it's definitely a both sides issue, but everything else is the GOP, and we need to recognize it. And the GOP oftentimes, they admit it. There's I actually had a couple slides of just these long lists of Republicans in the last 20 years have been open about voter ID laws, and they've only done that to suppress the vote. But I got rid of most of those, and I just wanted to record the last couple of them. Like for example, that Mitch McConnell, the Democrats aren't part of one of the COVID relief packages. They put together all this money for voter rights, they're making it like a voting holiday, federal holiday, and to invest more money into voter security and to, same day registration and things like that. All things just to make it easier. I mean, it wasn't pushing, it wasn't partisan. It was just about making things easier to vote. And Mitch McConnell literally said, he called it a power grab. And he wouldn't even, acknowledge this bill, or acknowledge the parts of the COVID release, which I mean, 2020 is looking pretty scary right now, the election, because Republicans are doing everything they can right now to suppress the vote, particularly around COVID and around mail-in voting. And then Justin Clark, a senior political advisor, actually got caught, saying this, that, he was recorded this at this Republican National Lawyers Association, where he basically said, like, traditionally, it's always been Republicans suppressing votes in places. Let's start projecting our voters. We know where they are. Let's start playing offense a little bit more. And what he's talking about is because of the federal judge let that ban, that 20-year ban on the Republican Party from, being poll watchers. He's talking about this massive effort of poll watching that they're about to unleash. So it's going to be in all Black communities in swing states. There's going to be tons of Republicans that are just like harassing these voters. And then on Trump, I mean, one good thing about Trump is he's just really open about what he's doing. Multiple times on Fox and Friends, he openly admitted, things like one time he said the things that they had in there are crazy. He's talking about the $400 million in the COVID relief package to kind of help run fair elections. And they had levels of voting that if you ever agree to it, you never have a Republican elected in the country again. So he's basically admitting that if we made elections open to everyone, there wouldn't be Republicans anymore. And then, he admits multiple times, like another, he's like trying to actively right now dismantle our post office, because right now our U.S. Postal Services needs help, administering, right now. They're on overload right now. There's a lot of problems right now, and they need the investment. They need to be part of some of these bailouts, but Republicans keep on removing them from any funding, from their bailouts, or from these COVID bailouts. And Trump is openly admitting it. I mean, he said on Fox and Friends, he said they need the money in order to make the post office work, so it can take all these millions and millions of ballots. If we don't make a deal, that means they don't get the money. That means they can't have universal mail-in voting. They just can't have it. So he's openly admitted that letting more people vote is bad for the Republican Party, and at the same time, he understands with COVID, most people are going to be voting through the mail, so that's why he's right now dismantling the U.S. postal system. So yeah, he appointed a new Louis DeJoy, some Trump donor, has no experience operating anything close to a postal service, and he's like removing mail sorting machines, mailboxes. I mean, it's just we're going to see it's going to be a nightmare this 2020 election. And then the last thing I want to talk about with voter suppression is just the role that dark money plays in Citizens United. So dark money is when you spend, it's spending meant to influence political outcomes where a source of money is not disclosed. So it's basically, money used for political campaigns outside of actual political campaigns, but to influence political campaigns, and no one knows where that money is coming from. And so that can happen in three different ways. One is that you can use these federal nonprofits like 501c4s, these political nonprofits, and they can, pump in. Generally, they're under no legal obligation to disclose their donors. So a lot of money can be pumped through these people, and they're not supposed to work directly with campaigns, but they still coordinate with campaigns and launch all kinds of ads, TV ads, and things like that. Super PACs is another one. So PACs is a political action committee, but most political action committees have like very low limits, like you can only donate $5,000 per candidate per election. Super PACs, it came about after the Citizens United and other court cases, basically eliminated that. You can donate as much as you want as long as your super PAC doesn't coordinate with the actual campaign. As long as that money is not donated to the actual campaign, like donate to the actual Democrat or Republican Party or candidate, and as long as they're not coordinating. But I mean, there's no actual enforcement. No one's actually monitoring if these super PACs are actually coordinating or not. And then in reality, they do coordinate a lot. But this is a way where Koch brothers and these billionaires can actually funnel billions of dollars into these super PACs. PACs and start running, campaigns on to around certain issues and elect certain people. And then the last one is having limited liability corporations, where you can you can accept money from these super PACs and nonprofits, and again you can hide the donors. So dark money groups have spent roughly according to OpenSecrets.org, and dark money groups have spent roughly $1 billion, mainly on television, online ads, and mailers to influence elections in the decade since 2010. Citizens United Supreme Court ruling that gave rise to politically active nonprofits. So that really, dark money has always been around, but it's really the floodgates have opened after the Citizens United case, which Citizens United was this conservative group that, nonprofit was raising money to run, attack ads against Hillary Clinton in 2010. They violated some rights, so they got they couldn't run the ad that they wanted to run, so then they sued. They went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court again said that First Amendment he ruled that the free speech clause of the First Amendment prohibits the government from restricting independent expenditures for the political communication by corporations, labor unions. So basically, the Supreme Court said because of the free speech clause, anyone can donate whatever they want, just ignoring the fact that like how much more corporations can be, how influential they can be, and how much more power they have over individuals. It was a horrible ruling, which again, this is the Supreme Court. Again, it's not a neutral body. This is a very politically active body that ruled in favor of the political right on this one, and enable corporations and other outside groups to spend unlimited amount of funds. And since then, we just see this explosion of funding that's just being pumped into these campaigns, which is spreading so much false information and spreading so much polarization. And it's just and that that on top of this speechnow.org versus FEC was another case that basically ruled that PACs that didn't contribute directly to candidates could accept unlimited contributions. So that's when we see this emergence of the super PAC, where normally, like I said, PACs before, you can only donate $5,000 per person per candidate per election. But these super PACs, you can now donate unlimited amount. You can donate billions of dollars if you want, as long as you don't coordinate with the actual candidate or their political party, even though there's nobody to make sure and to monitor if you're coordinating or not. So it's insane. From 2010 to 2018, super PAC spent approximately $2.9 billion on federal elections. Notably, the bulk of the money comes from just a few wealthy individual donors. In the 2018 election cycle, for example, the top 100 donors to super PACs contributed nearly 78% of all super PAC spending. So that literally means 100 donors contributed 78% of contributed like $2 billion to influence our elections. So it's pretty crazy. The election, Suppression Center says election system that skewed heavily toward wealthy donors also sustains racial bias and reinforces racial wealth gaps. So this is directly linked to the fact that because most of our wealth is in white people's hands, and now that they have no restraints and they can donate as much as they want to political parties, that this is going to ensure white supremacy, and it's going to continue, racial wealth gaps and racial biases, and create governments that are more in tune to help out white people while ignoring, civil rights of black people. So it's pretty messed up. All right, so that's the end of this section, end of this class. I leave you with just some resources as well around different places to kind of research more of things that we talked about throughout this class. I know it was a big one, encompassing a lot of different areas. But yeah, thank you all so much for if you made it through these classes, and we'll talk to you soon with the next class.